It was dawn in the Vatican when the cathedral bells still slept under the weight of the Roman fog. No liturgy scheduled, no meeting announced. The apostolic palace rested beneath the invisible rhythm of sacred structures, as if heaven itself were breathing slowly, waiting for something. But on that day, something moved. Something tore the thin veil that separates the ordinary from the supernatural. Without warning, without entourage, without announcement, Pope Leo XIV crossed the inner cloister of the Vatican alone. His footsteps, wrapped in cold marble, did not echo, they were absorbed. There was a silence around him that did not come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something else. A silence heavy with mystery, with weight, with invisible presences. For the first time in years, security cameras recorded the Supreme Pontiff outside any scheduled agenda. No cardinals, no Swiss guards, no assistants, only him, and behind him, something no one could explain. The artificial lights of the curious corridors flickered 3 times, as if the electricity itself could feel the spiritual tension of the moment. Some staff would report, days later, an inexplicable restlessness, as if they had seen someone or something following the Pope at a distance. Without form, but with presence. Leo XIV walked slowly, rosary between his fingers, but no words left his lips. His mouth was shut, his gaze fixed, his soul in transit. He was not going to a meeting, nor to a speech. He was descending not only physically down the stairs to the crypt of St. Peter, but spiritually, descending into the depths of what the Church had forgotten, to the roots of the sacred, to the point where the history of faith bends before mystery. The Vatican recorded the path, but did not publish it. The only image that leaked came from an anonymous staff member. It showed Leo XIV in profile, hands clasped, walking, followed by a stretched shadow that, strangely, did not align with any known source of light. The doubt spread like wildfire through Vatican corridors. Theologians tried to explain, mystics tried to interpret, skeptics tried to debunk, but the fact remained untouched. That day, the Pope was not walking alone, and no one knew what or who was walking behind him. But one thing was certain, Leo XIV knew. When Leo XIV reached the underground crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, the world was still asleep, but in the bowels of Rome something was waking up. It wasn't a noise, it wasn't a sound, it was a presence invisible, yet unrelenting, that filled each stone block, like an ancient perfume released from an urn sealed for centuries. He entered alone, the door closed behind him, and what happened inside was not recorded by any official camera. But there were witnesses. A Bulgarian monk, under a perpetual vow of silence, was praying in a dark corner of the crypt when he saw the Pope approach. Francis's tomb. Leo XIV collapsed to his knees, but not in a liturgical or choreographed way. It was a spiritual fall. The Pope's entire body seemed to surrender, as if it was no longer he who moved, but something within him or behind. When him that pushed him to the ground, the crypt, already naturally silent, became another realm. Time seemed suspended. The air grew denser, as if the walls were breathing with the very breath of the suffering church. The monk later wrote in his journal, the Pope wasn't praying. The Pope was weeping, but those were not human tears. They belonged to many. 2 centuries. To martyrs, to traitors, to saints and sinners. The floor of the crypt seemed to absorb them as if it was starving. And then, something happened. A light tremor rippled through the ground. The candles around the tomb flickered, though there was no wind. The icon of St. Peter, fixed to one of the side columns, slightly shifted at its base. Nothing destructive, but profound. As if an ancient energy had stirred. As if a spiritual reality had crossed the layers of the visible. Through a sacred crack opened in that instant. Leo XIV touched the stone of the tomb, and whispered something no one heard. But the monk described what he saw. His lips didn't move, yet something was spoken, as if the prayer were being made in spirit, or by someone beyond him. 47 minutes later, when Leo XIV emerged from the crypt, he was pale, but not exhausted, transformed. His expression was neither sadness nor joy, but knowledge, as one who saw something that should not be seen, and yet accepted it. In the upper corridors, the guards noticed his absence, but when he emerged from the darkness, everyone stopped, because his eyes reflected something that did not come from within the Vatican, but from elsewhere. Back on the surface, the Pope said not a single word, and that was exactly when the real spiritual earthquake began. The images captured by a faithful, shaky, grainy, seemingly ordinary, quickly circulated the world with unimaginable speed. But it wasn't the image of the kneeling Pope that first stirred unease. It was what was behind him, frame by frame. Video experts began to notice something strange. During the moment when Leo XIV remained kneeling before the tomb of Francis, a shadow moved behind him. But curiously, the shadow did not behave like any other. It did not respond to the light. It seemed alive, autonomous, independent of the natural sources of illumination. In the crypt, and more disturbingly, it had no human shape. Some described it as a cloak, others as a thick black mist, almost liquid, but none could define its outline. What they saw was a movement, spiritual, as if something was there not to threaten but to observe, to witness, to confirm. And the more experts analyzed the footage, the more reports emerged from viewers experiencing inexplicable symptoms, sudden chills, accelerated heartbeats, the feeling of a presence. There was no sound, no music, just a mute image, and yet something communicated through it. The Vatican reacted immediately. The video was requested for internal review, but it was not removed from the internet because it was too late. Copies had already spread, and thousands of the faithful began interpreting the phenomenon. Was it an angel? Was it a demonic manifestation? Was it the soul of Pope Francis present? But perhaps the most unsettling question was the simplest. What if it wasn't a shadow? What if it was a sign? The Vatican's silence only deepened the mystery. No spokesperson, no technical explanation, no denial. And while social media flooded with debates, theories, and speculation, older theologians unearthed writings from the 13th century speaking of the shadow of intercessors, a mystical expression describing a spiritual presence that accompanies moments of intense offering of prayer, especially when the soul of the one praying becomes a channel between heaven and earth. According to these writings, when a pure man prays with his whole heart, a divine shadow covers him, not to hide him, but to mark him. If that is true, then Leo XIV was not alone in that moment. He was covered, sealed, surrounded by something most eyes could never perceive, but which was captured unintentionally by a trembling cell phone in the hands of a believer. A technical detail discovered by an Italian video expert raised even more intrigue. The shadow appears only when the Pope is in total silence. When he rises, the shadow vanishes, as if silence were the language that attracted it, or the veil that revealed it. There's no way to prove it, no way to replicate it, but everyone who watched that footage felt it. The Pope's gesture was being witnessed not only by us, but by something beyond us. That afternoon, on the same day, when Leo XIV quietly left the crypt and walked in absolute silence toward the Basilica of St. Mary Major, there were no official cameras. Only a few faithful, unaware tourists and two young seminarians witnessed what they would later call the moment when time stopped. The Pope knelt before the ancient icon of the Virgin Salis Populi Romani, the mother who protects Rome, the mother who watches over her children. But it was the exact moment he placed his face between his hands, in a silent plea that something happened. One of the seminarians, weeping, began to repeat. She looked at him. She looked at him. At first they thought it was emotion, suggestion, but when others around them began murmuring the same, her eyes changed. She looked sadder. It's like she's alive. The atmosphere in the chapel changed entirely. A dense silence fell over everyone, a silence that did not come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something greater than sound. The icon, old and darkened by time, kept its traditional features, but those who looked saw differently. Mary's gaze seemed to have shifted slightly, as if for a fraction of a second she had truly looked at the Pope, a look of compassion, of recognition, of shared sorrow. Some swear the Pope's tear was not the first to fall, but a tear rolled down the face of the mother. Others insist the chapel's light changed, that one of the candles flared higher, that the scent of flowers filled the air. But none of this was caught on camera. None of it can be proven, only lived out when images of the Pope before the icon were released. Experts in sacred art, historians and critics began comparing photographs, from before, from after, from different angles. Many skeptics stated it's just the light, but others, even atheists, confessed something they couldn't explain, the feeling that the icon was alive. A Roman restorer, with decades of experience in sacred works, told L'Osservatore Romano, "I know that icon like I know my own face. I've cleaned its contours with my bare hands. But today it is not the same. It feels closer." There was no Vatican statement, no official communique, but a mass was hastily celebrated that same night, in thanksgiving. And since then, the faithful have lined up during the early hours just to look at the icon, not to ask, not to photograph, but to look, as if waiting for her, to look back. Theologians recalled a forgotten detail. In the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant was covered in gold on the outside but held the bread, the Word, and divine authority within. Mary is the new Ark. And that day, before the Pope's gesture, it was as if the lid had opened and the presence had breathed among us, even if only for a second. Some scholars called the phenomenon a silent epiphany, others a passive revelation, but those who saw needed no name because they knew something had happened and things would never be the same. Most curious of all, in none of the photos taken after the event does the icon appear exactly. The same subtle differences emerge. Small changes in the gaze, an imperceptible shift in the mouth, a faint glow where once there was shadow, and none of these changes are consistent. Each person sees something different, as if the icon reveals what the soul needs to see. That the icon did not change, we did. Because true divine manifestation does not alter the image, it alters the observer. And if this happened with a Pope kneeling before the Mother, what would happen to the world if we, too, knelt? What could be more invisible than air? What could be lighter, more indifferent, more common? And yet, that day, something in the air of the Vatican ceased to be ordinary. Security guards, used to years of routine, reported an unexplainable pressure in the chest. Clergy said they felt the basilica breathe for a few minutes. Even tourists unaware of who Pope Leo XIV was suddenly stopped upon entering, something they couldn't explain but could feel. It wasn't scent, it wasn't sound, it wasn't light. It was as if the space had gained weight. As if, instead of marble walls, they were inside the ribcage of a beating heart. A journalist described, "I went in for routine coverage, but the moment I stepped into the nave, I couldn't go on. My eyes filled with tears, and I felt with all my skepticism that something holy hovered there." They called it collective suggestion, emotional hysteria, a psychological effect. But no psychologist could explain why the birds nesting in the dome ceilings went silent for over 40 minutes, or why the city bells, without being triggered, echoed a muffled tone at 11:27 a.m. the same time. It was later discovered. When Pope Leo XIV was kneeling before the Virgin's image, inside the Vatican, the effect was even more radical. Documents, set for signing, were postponed. Meetings were cancelled without reason. Priests in conference left the room without saying a word. It was as if time had collapsed. Suspended. A cardinal from the Pontifical Council, anonymously, confessed he had never felt so much weight and lightness at the same time. And he added, it wasn't guilt, it wasn't fear. It was as if someone had entered the room and everyone knew without seeing that we must fall silent. Internal security footage revealed something even stranger. In the cameras aimed near the Pauline Chapel, the image flickered 3 times between 11:20 and 11:35. No technical failure was found, no electrical interference, but 3 flickers, accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature recorded by room sensors. The Vatican gave no comment. They merely reinforced security and restricted access to the footage. But the faithful knew, the air knew, the ground knew, something had touched the heart of Rome, and that something or someone was not of this world. Since that day, pilgrims began reporting similar sensations upon entering the basilica: fainting spells, sudden warmth in the chest, an uncontrollable urge to cry or pray without knowing why. Older religious sisters called it the weight of glory, a rare term in the Church's mystical tradition used to describe moments when the divine presence manifests not with spectacle but with gravity. The gravity of the invisible. What descended upon the Vatican that day was not collective emotion, it was a visit. And visits from heaven do not ask for permission. They simply impose themselves. Leo XIV's gesture was not limited to images, it was printed in the very air. An air that weighed, an air that healed, an air that converted, an air that reminded us that the Church's breath is, and always will be, prayer. And whoever breathed that air never breathes the same again. There are sounds that pass through the ears, and sounds that pass through the soul. On the morning Pope Leo XIV knelt, no loudspeaker played, no bell rang, no Gregorian chant echoed in the nave. The Vatican was in silence, but a sound was spreading, a sound without frequency, without audible vibration, a sound not heard by ears, but perceived by hearts, awake or asleep. Nuns in the cloister reported suddenly waking up in tears, without knowing why. Monks under perpetual silence left their cells and gathered unplanned before the altar. Faithful around the world said that at that exact hour they were overcome by an inexplicable urgency, as if something had to be done, as if a call had been made even though nothing had been said. And indeed nothing was said, but heaven was speaking. It was as if a silent trumpet had sounded from the tomb of Francis, passed through the Basilica of St. Mary Major, and echoed inside hearts. From Rome to Manila, Buenos Aires to Lagos, Paris to Tehran. A sound only. Those who have suffered in silence could recognize, as if their own pain had been given a frequency, a spiritual note, a lament, a cry, a divine whisper saying, "I am still here, come back." In the internal recordings, ambient microphones picked up an unusual noise like a constant bass note, almost imperceptible, but present throughout the time Leo XIV remained kneeling. Technicians tried filtering it. It wasn't a glitch, it wasn't electrical interference, it was something else. A sound engineer discreetly brought in to analyze it, said only, "I don't know what it is." But when we turned up the volume, we all got chills. Some scholars called it a mystical frequency. Others, more daring, compared it to biblical accounts. The sound Elijah heard before the earthquake, the sound that precedes presence, the sound of the Spirit. Can a sound come from heaven and no one hear it? Yes, because heaven speaks in the language of the soul in that day. This sound, inaudible to men, but heard by mountains, shook the foundations of the spiritual world. The Pope's gesture produced no echo in the walls, but it echoed in the bones of the Church, as if calling back all those who had been lost, as if saying, "Children, the time is now." And that sound, though silent, still continues. It can be felt by one who kneels before the tabernacle in an empty church, by one who prays the rosary in a dark room, without hope, by one who approaches the Eucharist with a heavy heart and dry eyes. That is not the sound of words. It is the sound of presence, because there are moments in the history of faith when God needs to say nothing to be heard. And on that day the world listened, even if it cannot explain what it heard. No camera captured it. No lens recorded it. No image was released. But those with spiritual sensitivity know they were there. While Pope Leo XIV knelt before the tomb of Francis and the image of the Virgin Salus Populi Romani, all of heaven bowed. With him, close witnesses, who remained silent for weeks out of respect, slowly began to share what they saw, or rather, what they felt. A veteran nun from the Sisters of Charity, used to decades of liturgical routine in the Vatican, confessed, "Through tears, I felt a warmth behind me, but not physical. It was as if something, or someone, was watching me with both tenderness and power. I fell to my knees without knowing why." Another account came from a young Swiss guard, skeptical, trained to observe, not feel. But that day he could not maintain his military posture. My eyes welled up without reason. The air felt heavier, as if time had stopped. I swear that, for a moment, I saw a shadow of wings on the ground, but when I turned, no one was there. Supernatural silence had settled in, but within it the presence was unmistakable. Invisible, yes, but undeniably real. Theologians called it a moment of intersection, a rare instant when the veil between the natural and the supernatural grows thin, like Mount Tabor, like Gethsemane, like Fatima. Now, like the tomb of Francis. And that's why many bishops, priests, and faithful across the world felt the same spiritual weight, even thousands of miles away. Because where angels are, there is communion. And where there is communion, there is spiritual resonance. Leo XIV's gesture was not solitary. He was surrounded by the angels who guard the church, by the saints who pray for us, by the souls who never stopped believing, and by the mother who, in silence, watches every child who returns. This cannot be broadcast on television. It cannot be photographed, it cannot be explained, but it can be lived. And if you, upon witnessing that gesture, felt something inside you move, perhaps it's because an angel passed close by.